Hey everyone, I thought it would be easier to make a video instead of trying to communicate through Google Classroom. On the notes for today, we're kind of covering a couple of harder concepts, so I just wanted to make a video to make this a little bit easier. Feel free to raise your hand and ask for the video to be paused at any time so we can ask questions and maybe slow down and write notes. As I'm talking, you should be writing down this title right here to start. And then once you've had this title written down, then we can move on and start looking at some examples of solving quadratics with square roots. Okay, so first let's talk about using square roots to solve in general. So it's important to note, and this is something we've talked about before, where if you have a square root of something, you actually tend to have two answers instead of one. Let me show you what I mean. So the square root of, let's say, 100. What do you think that is? Well, normally you would give the answer 10, right? But the truth is, it's not just 10, because there's a second thing that you can multiply by itself to make 100. Not just positive 10, but you can also take negative 10, because negative times a negative makes a positive. So really our answer is both positive and negative 10. And so if you're wondering what I just wrote, I wrote a plus sign over a minus sign, indicating that I have two different answers. Another way that you could write this is that you could write down both answers. So you could say the square root of 100 is equal to negative 10 or positive 10. Right, so there's two different ways you can write that down. And that makes sense, because if we're taking the square root, it's important to know that there's two different answers. The only time that you won't do it this way is if the problem specifically asks for a positive or a negative answer, basically. So for example, if you see something like, what's the positive answer to the square root of 100? You would write positive 10, right? And the same thing is if you see something like, what's the negative answer to the square root of 100? And notice for this one, the negative sign is not in front, it's inside the little check mark. So it indicates that we're actually looking for negative 10 versus, and sometimes you'll see this. In fact, I think there's a couple problems in your book that will actually indicate that they want both answers by putting this. But for argument's sake, if there's nothing written, we're just going to assume that it wants both answers, okay? And the reason why is because right now we're solving quadratics. And so if we're solving for quadratics, we want to get two answers, right? So for example, if I take a quadratic or the shape of a quadratic, and I'm asking for the x value when y is equal to, let's just make a little graph off to the side to show this example. So let's say I'm asking for the x value when y is equal to 2. You're going to notice that you have two different answers, right? So you have two answers when it comes to solving for quadratics, which means I have to figure out what the negative and the positive value is if I'm using square roots to do so. Okay, let's move on to some examples using quadratics. So first off, we've got example A. So example A is going to have 3x squared minus 27 is equal to 0. Okay, so from here, we don't have any square roots to take, but let's go ahead and solve this one step at a time and see what happens. So if we add 27 to both sides, we end up with 3x squared is equal to 27. Okay, I still don't have a square root that I'm dealing with. But what happens if I divide by 3 now? Now I have x squared is equal to 9. Okay, now I see something. Now I see that I can take the square root of 9, and I can also take the square root of x squared. Because the square root of x squared, well, a square root and a square are just opposites, so those two things cancel each other, right? Leaving me with just x. If I take the square root of one side, I have to take the square root of the other side. So that means my x value is going to be equal to whatever the answer is to the square root of 9. And remember, we just talked about how we have two separate answers. So x can either be equal to -3 or x can be equal to 3. So this should start to look familiar. Because remember when we were doing factoring and we were getting two answers every time? Well, not every time, but most of the time we were getting two answers. That's the same thing here. So this is just a second method or another method for solving for quadratics. Okay, let's look at another example. So for example B, we have x squared minus 10 equal to -10. Now let's see what happens when we try and solve this one. We add 10 to both sides, which gets rid of that 10 on that side, giving me x squared is equal to, okay, wait, that just canceled out, so I'm left with 0. Okay, that's really interesting. If I take the square root of both sides, I end up with x is equal to, and remember we have to have two answers, except, can I have a negative or a positive 0? Well, not really. 0 is kind of the exception to the rule, where there's really only one type of 0, and that's just 0. 0 is not negative or positive, it's just 0. So that means this is my one case where I have one answer, is if I end up with, if I end up taking the square root of if I end up taking the square root of 0, I get one answer. Okay, let's look at another example. We got example C, -5 x squared plus 11 equals 16. Okay, let's take this one step at a time. We do notice that there is a perfect square that we could take the square root of, but I can't really take the square root of all this. So maybe we need to move some things around first. So let's go ahead and subtract 11 from both sides. I get -5 x squared equal to 5. Divide by 5. Divide by 5. Or actually, sorry, not 5, but -5. That leaves me with x squared is equal to -1. Now remember, when I get down to the x squared, now I can take the square root. But something funny kind of happens when I try and take the square root of a negative number. Notice that we can't take the square root of a negative number because there's no two numbers, or there's not a single number that multiplies by itself to get a negative number. Think about it. -1 times -1 makes +1. +1 times +1 also makes +1. So there should always be a positive number on the inside here. So if you end up taking the square root of a negative number, then you know that this has no solution. Okay, so we got three scenarios on here. You've got one scenario where you get a positive number that you're taking the square root of. That gives you two answers. Okay, so we're going to note that. So notice that positive means 2 answers. So that's the first point. Next point is, we'll do it right here. 0 means, now this is going to kind of be confusing because I'm saying the word 0 and then saying that there's 1 answer. 1 answer. Okay? And then a negative means no answers. Okay, so that's what you should learn from this. Okay, what I want you to do is we're gonna stop this video and we'll have a second video for you here in a second. But for now, I want you to go ahead and do page 464, numbers 1 through 3 all. And when I come back, I'll show you what the answer should be, okay?